Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Evolve, where we focus on the evolution of leadership.
Things have changed, yet we evolve and adapt. But what's next, and what's next for you? Evolve focuses on the intersection of leadership, technology, and workplace. Don't get left behind. Join us in this evolution. Rise and evolve with us.
I'm Kim Ford, your host, and I have a very special guest here today from Singapore. Could you take a minute, introduce yourself and your company?
Hi, Kim. Thank you so much. Good morning to you. Greetings from Singapore. My name's Graham Brown. I'm a storyteller by trade. That's my job. I found a way of getting paid for telling stories and helping people tell stories, which I think is kind of important. If you're in the leadership space, if you're a leader, whether you're a leader by title or by the fact that you have people's attention, storytelling is probably the most important skill that you have in your toolbox. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of my insights that I use in the corporate space and some of my learnings, what works and what doesn't work when it comes to storytelling and leadership.
Well, we are extremely excited to hear more about storytelling. I know that, I guess people tell me I'm a good storyteller. I don't realize that's what I'm doing. Because I give examples that are live from a different client that experienced something similar, and that's, I guess, storytelling. I just never thought I was a storyteller until somebody told me that. So I think this will be really interesting, and I'm excited to hear more. Talk about storytelling organization. What does that mean? What is that?
So if you think about it, there are many organizations that touch our lives, whether we work for them or they're our clients or our partners, or we want to work for them. Whatever it is, those stories contain lots of individuals, lots of human beings, and traditionally the human beings have been kind of locked inside these organizations, and it's always been the official brand story, whether it was here is the Pepsi official brand story, or here is the Microsoft official brand story, and everybody had to effectively just cookie cutter that story and push it out to media. That's how it worked for many years. But as we all know, things are changing. Audiences are changing. Audiences, they don't want official narratives anymore, or they don't necessarily believe them like they used to. So like you said, Kim, storytelling, that could be as simple as sharing anecdotes. It doesn't have to be, a 3-part trilogy, an epic. It can be very simple. And that's the point. It's a tool within the reach of everybody. And so a storytelling organization is an organization that is changing the dynamic from a very traditional view of communication and leadership, which is very sort of top-down pipeline, which we all know is sort of a legacy model, which is going away, if you like, but it's still the default, to a new model of communication and leadership, which is platform, which is, rather than how do we push this story, how do we curate the story from the people inside our organization? So a storytelling organization is one that really unlocks that human potential inside. And that's what leaders do. They don't necessarily have to have the best stories. Leaders aren't always on stage or always having answers. Good leaders today are about giving their people a voice, about giving their people the tools and the green lights, importantly, the air cover to go and tell stories and say, it's okay, you can be human. You can, talk about things which aren't necessarily on brand. And that's hard. That's the real challenge. So a storytelling organization is about creating a platform for its people to tell stories.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'm in the commercial real estate business, and it's an extremely white, older, male dominated business. It always has been.
I apologize.
In the United States, it's about, probably 98%. And what's amazing is what I'm finding is a lot of people, especially women that are in, very successful in their positions across the country, can't tell stories on social media, because the company pretty much shuts them down. They're not allowed to really come out of the box, even in the slightest bit, because the company wants to control the message. And so I find that to be interesting as social media continues to become more and more important, and building your own personal brand, especially if you're in the brokerage sector, which I am, is really important, because that's really who you are and how you get business. But to kind of be held back, I think, from being able to tell stories, being able to do anything unique or genuine, I think is a challenge. What are you seeing the trends in technology and how that's impacting, being able to freely tell a story, right? Like, what are you seeing out there with tech?
Yeah, you've really identified the key to the problem there, is that this is what the audience wants and this is what corporations are going to do, and there's a big gap in between, and that seems to be generational, to some degree demographic as well. The reality is today, if you look at the nature of engagement and the nature of marketing and communications, the bottom line is that people follow people, not brands. That's what's changed. That's changed from 20, 30 years ago. If you grew up in the world of brand marketing and advertising, it was big ideas, folks. It was, the big ad agencies could turn a boring product into an exciting story. It was, Pepsi Generation, or, even taking, a very germane product and making an exciting advertising campaign about it. That's what advertising and marketing was all about. It's about the ad agency and the marketing agency creating the story, right? But today, we don't buy that anymore, because advertising is no longer the social proof it once was. As seen on TV. So what? Doesn't mean anything now. Like,
right.
You got 11-year-old kids on YouTube TV. Doesn't mean anything now. So that's shifted. And if you look, for example, I mean, you ask about tech as an example, Kim. Take Microsoft, which I've mentioned already. Probably one of the most famous tech brands in the world. Huge ad budgets, of course. And you look at, for example, how they're using social media, which is really interesting, that they have a LinkedIn page. They part-own LinkedIn, so you'd expect it. And I was looking on it the other day, and on their LinkedIn page, they've got these stock photos. And on these stock photos, it's kind of like customer success stories. And, here is something grabbed off a stock photo website with a little bit of content. That's very typical. I'm not necessarily singling out Microsoft. That's very typical of how a tech company advertises or markets. And they were getting like 3, 4, 5 likes in 24 hours. And I was like, wait a minute. This company has 12 million followers on LinkedIn, and it's getting a handful, literally on one hand, likes. And I went back 24 hours later and it was 5 likes. That doesn't make sense. And yet here's the thing, Kim. So Satya Nadella is the CEO of Microsoft, and he has posted quite a bit on LinkedIn as an individual. And he's talked about transformation, leadership, change, challenge, different kind of things. And his posts would get like 30, 40,000 likes. And that is a powerful case study in the change, the shift, isn't it? Because nobody cares about the brand. They care about the people. And very much our experience of the brand, whether it's tech or real estate, is through the people. That's how I'm experiencing the brand now, through you and your stories. So what Microsoft has to do, or any brand, is it has to say to its leaders, whether they are, the first-time leaders or the CEOs, here are the tools, here are the parameters in which we're okay. It's fine that you can talk about these things within these parameters. That's the green light and the guardrails we're going to give you.
Yeah.
And you go out and tell your stories in a human way, because that's how people are going to engage with us. It's all very good and it sounds right, but you've mentioned it already. The generational aspect is key here, because, if you've done 30 years in corporate comms and you're at the top of your game, you're not going to change the rules overnight and suddenly start doing it a different way. So that's the challenge, is we've got to wait for those guys to kind of retire and move on for the younger people to come through, right?
Yeah, for sure. And, I think the way that you and I are talking through how this could work, for people that are really struggling coming into my industry in general, is I think if a company and the marketing team we use is incredible, and they came up with pillars. So we develop pillars for our company, and under those pillars, there's all types of potential content you can build. But if it doesn't fall under the pillars, it's not good content for us. And so what I love about that is if companies develop these pillars and then they enable their people to create content, as long as it falls within the pillars, then I think it's a win-win for everybody. There's those boundaries you talked about, right? That you have to have. But then there's this great opportunity for people to think out of the box instead of keeping them in this box, which, like you said, I guarantee you these same companies are struggling because their box has, 1 million viewers, yet at the same time, their people is really what people care about. It is business to business has changed drastically to this unique, slight business to consumer business. So it's the people more business to the employee business. And it's this interesting mix that I think a lot of larger companies haven't grasped that. They haven't enabled people to flourish. And I think it's a huge problem. Until they do that, they're really going to my type of company, a boutique firm, is going to actually run circles around them in many cases because we have a voice and we enable people to have a voice. Because we're small enough that that we can kind of grab a hold of it, and we have defined those boxes for people to be in. So I think it's really interesting. Let's talk about strategy and communication and how those can work together, because strategy is everything, right? So we have a strategy, and in many ways, those to me fall under those pillars, right? That strategy, that's this overarching goal. And then how do we communicate, right? Those they really have to work well.
Yeah, I really like this idea of creating the pillars. That's a smart move. That's, if you look at all leadership, what they're really looking for, they're not looking for bigger budgets. They're just looking for better air cover in what they do. They want to know that they're going to get that bandwidth to go and do what they're really good at. And that's the connection, the conversations, the storytelling, and do that without fear. It's taking the fear out of it, really, isn't it? It's giving them that safe space, that psychological safe space where they can operate in at their full potential, knowing that if I say hashtag whatever the trending hashtag is of the moment, I'm not going to get pilloried. I'm not going to get pulled up for this. Yeah. So that's really important. That's the part of the communication part. And then there's giving them the tools, which is really, you don't have necessarily the tools because, this could be a corporate resource that we could use. It could be a podcast, for example. It's got the distribution, it's got the shared resources internally. It's giving them the tools to do that. So, that's the platform part of it as well. And you mentioned, Kim, business to employee. Now, this is a really interesting space because what we're seeing in terms of communication and branding and how brands lead is that the way companies treat, or the way leaders treat their people, is the way the people treat the customers. You can't fake that exchange, can you? No. You can't talk about, you got to be customer centric and then treat your employees terribly, right? It's a reflection of that. And in many ways, it's really a propagation of that. So, you can't now implant this proxy experience, which is this, logo or, the brand campaign of the old days, or the big idea. You can't import this proxy and then that becomes the strategy, right? Becomes the way that you actually convey the story to your people. Now people see straight through that. So it's coming right down to your brand is a function of your people, and your people really are a function of all those conversations that you're having internally. That is the brand now, what people talk about. And if you look, take, for example, Tesla, they don't have a PR department. Why do you need one when you have the CEO out there
who doesn't stop
creating conversations, right? I mean, obviously he's a character, so he's got something going for him. But what he has going for him ultimately is he doesn't care. He's fearless about what people say. He's going to make mistakes. Yeah, he does some silly things, but come on, like, what's the PR value of that guy in your company, right? It far outweighs the cost. That's the payoff. And as you say, companies like yours that can run rings around them, is because you're much more agile. You're much more able to take on those risks and make those calculated decisions that, okay, we're going to do this, right? And the big guys are fearful, and that's what's killing them. That's what's strangling them. That's why they can't behave. That's why a smaller niche specialist can eat away at a large incumbent, and you've got all these kind of incumbents, because the large incumbent can't be everywhere talking to everybody all the time in an authentic way.
But can you imagine if they enabled their people to actually talk around those guidelines, around those pillars specifically, and how incredible some of these companies could actually become because they have the mass. I don't have the mass. I don't have enough of those voices. But, you take these larger companies, if you actually give them the ability and you give them the tools, they could become incredible. And I think that's what we're going to see within the next 3 to 5 years, a major shift on where success is, and some companies that are going to come from nowhere and really explode because they're going to embrace this.
That's the vision, Kim.
Yeah.
You're talking, that's the promised land for these
Yeah.
organizations. That reality for brands, organizations today is that their story is just one bird in the tree. If you imagine it, and that's, oh, wait a minute, I thought we were the only one around, and now there's like thousands. So what do? Do you fight it, or do you embrace it, like you say? And what would happen if we empowered all our people? You look at the psychology of it, and this is where leaders have to really see their role as the enabler as opposed to the gatekeeper of this. Is that you look at the psychology, a lot of studies have been done about this, like the average human being, and this is going way back to Stone Age time, has 150 connections. And Stone Age societies were averaged 150 people. The Apple Mac development team had 150 people in it. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because that's the optimum level of our connections. So you can't have 1 million followers meaningfully, right? You can have 1 million followers or friends, as they're called these days. It's being sort of co-opted, isn't it? That idea, but 150 meaningful, like you can try and fake it, but ultimately it comes back to 150. But 150 people know 150 people. That's 22,500 people that you could connect with authentically. Now think about the math in that for a Microsoft or anybody who has those kind of numbers, is that they can make a very big authentic impact at scale. If only they enable that many-to-many connection that you're talking about. And that is the challenge. And that's more of a mindset shift than what tools or what technologies do we need to, take on board to make this happen.
Yeah, that's so true. And about a week ago, obviously, I guess it is a story, and I was storytelling, but I took what my family lives also in Naples. So my husband and son live in North Naples, and I lost total communication with them during the hurricane. And then I started seeing on LinkedIn and actually on Twitter a picture of the storm surge about 12 feet and right around the block from our home. And so I wrote this story about what it's like to lose communication, and think about that as a business, right? As a business owner, as a business leader, like we planned, we went and got a generator, and I was down there, I flew back Sunday, and we got everything we could. We thought it was going to Tampa. And so, which is 2 hours north. And so, yeah, we planned, we had everything in order, but we never imagined it would impact us. We never imagined it would come that close, the storm surge. And then here I am. So what I did was, I guess now just talking to you, I told a story, and I related it really in many ways to business, and how no matter how much we plan for something, we never can really plan enough because things happen that are outside of our control. And so I guess that's a story. What I think, at least I think I do right, is I allow a little personal glimpse into my life. And I think people really love that. I think the piece that I missed that I couldn't do is people want to see you. And I wasn't there. I was the person in the North that had no communication with my family, right? But I think that authentic piece is what people really love and what people really need. And that's the piece that organizations need to enable their people to do, to be who they are within those boundaries.
There's a key part to that story, Kim, and that's the vulnerability in it. Is that you sharing that story shared with us? Firstly, you were worried, you were concerned, it wasn't perfect. Such is life, right?
Right.
And you were vulnerable. You were vulnerable firstly because your loved ones were there, but also because of the storm and something you couldn't control. You can't sort of build a wall around this thing. That's life hanging by the threads, right? And the interesting part about that story is it shares a vulnerability that we all feel that makes us human. And a lot of people now talk, for example, about, what about AI and music, or AI and art, or AI and stories,
Yeah.
well, they can recreate that very effectively, and they can write music, they can paint, they can create drawings, but they don't create art. And the difference being is that, as in your story, or as in a human being or an artist, they put vulnerability into their work. And that is why we connect with it. And if you look at any story ever told, movies, books, whatever you feel, every song you've ever listened to, you think about the hero, they always have a weakness. Achilles has the heels, and Superman had the kryptonite, and every superhero has a vulnerability.
Right.
Because if they were to tell that story without a vulnerability, we would just think, I know what's going to happen. They're going to win. They're boring. They're
Yep.
not going to get beaten down by the bad guy, and then, oh no, this
Right.
is the end. We're not going to go through that cycle and feel it. And that's so important, because to make a story engaging, it has to be vulnerable. It has to show that human aspect. And that then brings us back to leadership. What could they learn from your story? Is that, that in an essence, in 30 seconds, is how to tell a story. It's something that's meaningful to you, and you're exposing your vulnerability to everybody, and you could be criticized
Yeah.
for
Oh,
that.
for sure. Oh, for sure.
But you
Absolutely.
stepped up, and you're daring to be vulnerable, and that is
Right.
what leaders have to do. They don't have to be more inspiring, they don't have to be more impressive, they don't have to be more efficient, they just have to be more authentic. And that is to say, actually, I don't have all the answers, and this could go horribly wrong, but let me share with
But
you
this is
what's
my
going on.
truth, and here's a glimpse into it. And I think it's okay, and anybody at least that's on my team, I think it's wonderful. I think it's great to put yourself out there. I think being positive and saying where you messed up, right? We could have prepared better. They probably should have left,
Hmm.
but we never thought it was gonna. And there was a lot of miscommunication. And if we would have went to the European weather, we would have actually saw that it was tracking it better than the American weather. And so, I mean, looking back, right, in hindsight, but hindsight's not healthy either. So
Hmm.
I think it
You don't
just
have it
enables you in the
beforehand.
future.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Look,
Exactly. So, you do the best with what you can, and people will judge you for it. People will see weakness, but we all have weakness. And if people see that weakness and they're not comfortable with it, I don't think we really want to work with them anyway.
no, there's something
You
wrong.
know? Exactly.
We don't
Exactly.
trust
So,
people like that. So
no, very, very true. One of the words we use in our organization, and one of really a strong pillar that we stand behind, is future forward. We call it future forward. So when you think of future forward and you think of corporate communications, what impactful changes do you think have hit or are going to hit? Like, what do you see that if we think future forward, right? What does that look like?
that's a very good question. Future forward, we're in it right now. I think it was William Gibson who invented the word cyber. He said
Yeah.
that the future's already out there, it's just not evenly distributed. So it's pockets of the future hitting us in waves. So it's already here, and it's being absorbed, interpreted, and expressed by people who are probably a little bit more into the future than everybody else, like yourself. You're future
Yeah.
forward focused. So, how does it affect communication? What's affecting communication? Probably, obviously, we are now deep in a generational shift in social media. All the obvious things that you could talk about there. I think there are two probably bigger macro trends that are really affecting leadership and storytelling and organizations. And one being AI. I say that as an AI graduate myself, and I've waited a number of years for this time, 25 years actually, since I graduated. But AI is now changing the rules of the game, more in the sense that actually it's eating away a lot of the competencies of leadership, for in expertise, if you like, or even if you take professions like medicine. If you're a doctor, 60% of what you do is looking at imagery, scans, and you're looking at scans, diagnosing, prognosing diseases. So 60% of your work actually now can be done better by a machine. So it's not the low paid manual workers that are going to get replaced by machines. It's these guys. It's the doctors, the accountants, the lawyers, the guys that look at spreadsheets all day and different, spreadsheets meaning patterns, right? So that's one big shift. It basically means that what is then left of that competence, what are the skills that those people need to have? And it's the skills that machines can't possess, which is vulnerability and storytelling, right? Because, a doctor, a doctor can't compete with a machine on the basis of imagery. I mean, there've been competitions on this, right? And, they've pitted 60 doctors against one machine and the machine would win.
Oh,
these are
of
like
course.
oncology specialists, right?
Yeah.
So that means that leaders have to rethink what skill sets they need. And what a machine can't do is it can't sit beside your bed, hold your hand and say, are you okay? It can't do that meaningfully, because even though it could physically do it, it's never actually been there. It's never actually gone through the pain that you're experiencing. It's never, it's why it can't write a love song, because it's never lost a girlfriend or been stupid. And, like the hubris means that they've lost his love. Every single love song you've ever listened to is they've done something stupid, right? And then she's left him or whatever it is. So they've never gone through the pain. They've never gone through the experience, right? So that's one part. And then the second part is what we started off talking about today, which is the shift in organizations and how they communicate from this sort of pipeline to platform model. And to put it into context, people look at podcasts, for example. You have a podcast, I have a podcast, and you say, oh, everybody's got a podcast now. Well, there are 5 million podcasts in the world, right? And let's go back to 1998. There were 5 million websites in the world. And if you remember Netscape Navigator, those days, right? Windows 97, the glory days.
Yeah.
And why did people have websites? Because it was a more effective, efficient way of communicating with people, right? Because if you wanted to go to a store, did you phone up the switchboard? Did you drive down to the store to find out it was shut? The number one search term in 98 on Google for e-commerce was store opening hours. Like, it's easier to then phone up, Google this thing, right? Or whatever it was back, Alta Vista back then. So it was a better way a more efficient way of communicating with people. And then we had 5 million websites. Today we have 2 billion. People could never see that rise. So I look at podcasts today and people say, oh, everybody has a podcast. And I say, well, hang on a second. You're basing on the fact that one person, one brand, one podcast. That ain't the many to many reality that awaits us. What you talked about, if everybody could have a voice, and we're starting to see it, large organizations, management consultancies, banks, they don't have one brand, one podcast. They have one brand, maybe 10 podcasts now. That is the beginning, because I see a future where these organizations may have 100, 1,000 podcasts, because every leader, every practice, every project will have a voice. So it could be millions of brands, thousands of podcasts within them. That's the future. It may not be podcasts in sort of 30, 40-minute formats, but it may be smaller, micro, who knows?
Yeah.
But everybody will have a voice. And that's the fundamental shift. That's when we'll look back in 5, 10 years' time and we'll see that many-to-many reality. So where did that come from? Well, here it is, here right now. This is the kind of that sort of the future that's already happening today.
Well, a lot of people talk about brand authority, and I mean, it's just something tossed around. Tell us what your thoughts are.
Yeah, brand authority, interesting, isn't it? It's sort of come out of nowhere. Thought leadership, brand authority.
Yeah,
I'm a sort of student of or I'm a nerd of etymology. I like to look at words and whether the meaning behind the words. And if you look at authority, for example, even that word, author, authority, audience, audio, authentic, again, that gets mentioned a lot. Those 5 words all stem from the same ancient Greek root, the AU. And if you go back, it doesn't have a direct correlation in modern English because it's ancient Greek, not Greek. So in ancient Greek, that AU actually nearly roughly translates in English today to mean to feel or to perceive. And that's really important. If you think about all of those words like audio, we feel it. We feel in the ear the emotion of that person, right? You think about audience, authority, authenticity. We feel it. It's perception. It's not what it is, but it's how we perceive it. So authority is what we perceive that person to be, what we think and feel that person to be. So a big part of it is how we perceive them and also the emotion that goes with it. And
Mhm.
that sort of brings us full circle into the storytelling part, because that's key to creating authority. It's not having a title, it's not having that qualification even. And that is no longer a moniker of authority like it used to be. Really, if you look at authority today, it's like, do you have people's attention? That's it. So if you take us back a few years, you had a 17-year-old Swedish girl, Greta Thunberg, competing against the president of the United States of America, the former president, for the hearts and minds of the world's media and its people when it comes to climate change. And a 17-year-old girl was winning.
I
So
love it.
explain that to me. How does that
Yeah.
work in the model? With she doesn't have the resources and the press channels and
But
of
she had vulnerability. She had feeling. She had lots of things that the other party didn't have or care
that's
about,
it.
and it does win. And I think that ties back to that concept of vulnerability and authenticity. And she was passionate. And I think that when you're talking about a subject that matters, that passion shines through and you
Mm.
can see it.
Yeah. Yeah. The vulnerability part was interesting, wasn't it? Is that just hit that created authority, didn't it? Because actually, why was that person the authority in that space to talk in that manner and capture people's attention? Like you say, because she was passionate, because she really cared. And the interesting thing about Greta Thunberg is when she stood before, was it the United Nations? I can't remember.
Yeah.
And she delivered that speech about,
Yeah.
the generations have basically betrayed the young people. That was really interesting because it was kind of like, we've had climate change data for 120 years. It's been
Mhm.
around. There's over 1 billion web pages on climate change. And, scientists discovered it in like 1880. So it's not like, oh, well, this is something new. It's been around. We've known about this thing for well over 100 years, but it took not more data, but a better story to get that
Yes.
message home. And that's really important. I think if there's a takeaway for leadership today, you don't need better data. You don't need more data. You just need to think about the story. And like you say, Kim, it's the passion, that vulnerability that goes with it. And that's what we want to hear. If it's delivered right, that's powerful, right?
Yeah.
You can't, even if you're the president of the most powerful nation in the world, you can't compete against that.
No, you can. And clearly what she had was thought leadership. And she had passion in regard to a specific topic that she was a leader and had thought leadership in. What are your thoughts on thought leadership and how it impacts demand?
Mm. Yeah, there's a lot of studies, isn't there, about how, especially in the B2B
Yeah.
space, how vendors will use thought leadership content in their funnels and their sales process, and buyers really now rely on it, thought leadership. And I think PR studies, for example, like Edelman, produce a lot of thought leadership research, and they pretty much all iterate this. I mean, they all sort of say the same thing, which is that thought leadership probably is the most important factor in determining whether or not to buy from A or B. And obviously, thought leadership is wide, exactly what it is. But if you actually sort of drill down into the studies and look at what exactly is thought leadership, it's less about expertise. And that's the really interesting point, is because the whole model, traditional model of authority was based around expertise. You had a title, you had a qualification. And yet now we're in this era where it's less about expertise and more about empathy.
Yeah.
And those studies, the one particular study, I'll have to dig it out afterwards, but I'm sure your audience can go and Google it. But if you look at Edelman, for example, similar kind of B2B vendor studies, is that the number one reason wasn't, they were an expert in the area, but the reason why we bought with them is because they understood our problem. And that's really interesting because, like our default positioning to be a leader, a thought leader, is to say, this is what I know. on the stage, I'm going to tell you what I know. And so many brands, when they start a podcast, they say, oh, we want to talk about this. But, if you're running a radio station, it's never like, this is what I want to talk about. It's always, what do your listeners want to hear? What's their problems? And speak to that problem, speak to that pain point. That's thought leadership. And I really feel that those who are able to lean into that problem and say, actually, I really understand you. If they spent 80% of the time talking about the problem and then only 20% about the solution, that's probably the magic formula. Is to say, actually, I really get what you're going through. I understand. I feel it. I feel the frustration. I've been there. I've walked in your shoes. But everybody's, no, this is what I know. And that, I think, is thought leadership today. It's different to, 20 years ago, where it's like, wait, hang on, what's your doctorate in? Or how many years did you work at that big firm to qualify you to talk about this? Or, that was kind of the very efficient model. But the more sort of authentic model is like, do you understand me?
Yeah.
And so, my advice to leaders, and if you go on a podcast, is like turn expert mode off and empathy mode on. Lean into it.
I love it. So true. So true. And that advice to leaders is really critical. And so many of them don't want to show any vulnerability because they look weak. When I actually think showing vulnerability makes you strong.
It's hard though, isn't it? If you've done 20 years, 30 years playing the other game and being successful at it.
And right. And why do you need to change? And that to me is where the disconnect is, because they're not going to. Most of them. There are some. I mean, I have one client who, he's somewhere in his 60s, and he really does want to change. He wants to understand how he can relate better to who's next in the organization, and he cares, and so he's trying, and he brings the right people to these meetings so that he gets that input from that future generation, and it's pretty incredible because you can see him really trying to do it, but it's hard, right? Because he's been so successful his entire career, leading organizations to become a different person and to show a different side. And I think it's pretty incredible when you see somebody trying, instead of most people just shrugging it off thinking, well, I'm really good at what I do and I don't need to change. Well, it's a different world, and, people are, we have a talent war going on. We have all these challenges we never had before. So quite frankly, this might really be a great opportunity to maybe, I think impact a different group of people, try something different,
Well, maybe the answer is that we don't have to be ourselves the great storytellers, but maybe we can empower, like you
others.
say, in that war of talent, the people who want to do that, who are seeking that out. A lot of focus in hiring and retention of even, what do they call it now? Employee happiness.
Yeah.
Employer branding. These sort of concepts. A lot of the attention has always been about creating these really sort of nice workplaces and dynamic, and have a ball pit that you can play in and free beer and all that stuff. But ultimately, I think people, like, really deep down, people just want to kind of do meaningful work, and they don't want to gamify it, and they just want. And people, one of the most important things about meaning is being able to tell your story. And so, a leader that can do that is say, actually, I'm going to give you the tools to do this. Like, that's powerful.
That is
probably, there's probably an impact on the bottom line, how much they could retain their top talent and how much that would impact their PR and their marketing and their sales. I would like to see more leaders do that, Kim. I don't know, like, how common that is now. It takes somebody who's quite brave. And I suppose they haven't spent 30 years training their DNA, if you like, to do it the other way. So it'd be interesting to see how that kind of manifests in the next few years.
Well, thank you so much for so many takeaways, Graham. What a wonderful discussion. Loved every second of it. And I know our listeners will as well. Our goal with Evolve is to really help leaders learn, connect, and grow together. And couldn't do that without you. Thank you so much for your time today. And can't wait to continue connecting with you in the future.
Oh, thank you so much, Kim.